I look down on all the people looking up at the big sky. Everybody's pushing one another around.
Welcome to the 2-Month Review, a weekly podcast that was actually, for a very short period of time, the 24th most popular books podcast on iTunes last week.
All right.
Which I'm very excited about. And I'll talk about that more later, but this is weekly. We go over what we're doing on this podcast is taking a different book every 2 months and talking about it slowly but surely, week by week, chapter by chapter. And right now we're finishing up The Invented Part by Rodrigo Fresán. And in fact, this is essentially it's the penultimate episode, but I won't explain why it's the penultimate episode until the end. But this week we're going to be going over the very last section of the book, which, if I could figure out where this starts, it's the imaginary person. And it starts on page 445 and goes through the very end, which is 552. So it's like one of the longest sections of the book. And also, as always, I'm Chad, and I'm here with Brian Wood.
Hello, everybody.
And Valerie Miles is joining us this week. Valerie, I should have prepared an actual bio for you. And instead I was just like, oh, Valerie's going to be on. So Valerie one of the things I'm going to mention first is that she's the editor of 1,000 Forests and One Acorn, which is a book that Open Letter published, I think 3 years ago now? 2 years ago?
Yeah. 3 years, yeah.
Yeah, 3 years ago. That's a giant anthology of Spanish language writers, and we can talk about that more in a second. But she's also a publisher, writer, translator, and co-founder of Granta and Español. She's also the co-director of the New York Review of Books in Spanish translation, and in 2013, this is my favorite detail, was voted one of the most influential professionals in publishing by the Buenos Aires Book Fair. And you've been doing a lot of traveling recently.
Yes, I have.
So, what have you been up to?
Well, I've had a kind of one conference after the other, and are also traveling a lot with the last issue of Granta that we've been presenting in a number of different places. I just gave a paper in the American Association of Comparative Literature, American Comparative Literature Association in Utrecht, which was a lot of fun. And I was in Santander with a cultural journalism conference, which was also very interesting, talking about cultural diplomacy. And so very, very busy these past couple of days.
Yeah.
So you sound very smart and well spoken. We're going to need you to just dial that back a little bit, if you can, for this conversation.
I'll get down and dirty.
Okay.
I'll do my best.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
But before we talk about Fresán, too, I think, Brian, were you going to ask a question about the 1,000 Forests?
Oh, no, I just, I went through and was looking at it again, and lots of... Maybe just talk about the book a little bit. I think would be really neat because it's a collection of various, is it Spanish language?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Spanish language writers. I modeled it on an American anthology that came out in 1942 called This Is My Best. And the editors asked the writers then, who were some of the best writers, from Faulkner and Steinbeck to John Dewey and Lillian Hellman and Dorothy Parker, and they all asked. The editors asked one question, which was, "What are your best pages?" Which, of course, is a very painful thing to ask writers because they don't often like to consider, something. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack, but it's also kind of interesting to put them on the sofa and see kind of the similarities between how writers discuss their own work and consider their work, and try and get maybe a secret passageway into motivation and intention. So I did the same thing with a number of Spanish writers. I kind of chose a lot of the writers who are considered, the great writers of the end of the 20th century, and with a couple of writers that are perhaps less known, more shy about their work, but equally regarded. And so that was quite a task. It was putting the whole thing together. The funny thing is that I, in Fresán's book, in the invented part, on page, let's see, what is it? I think it's towards the end, like page 514, 514. He actually quotes that Quevedo poem that opens 1,000 Forests, and he calls it a Quevedian zombie.
Oh, right.
Yeah, exactly. Talking with your departed writers. No, that's how I opened the the anthology, which I thought was very funny.
That is, I didn't even think of that, but you're right.
A
That is
coincidence,
perfect.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's a funny coincidence.
Well, there are two little touch points I wanted to ask you about the book that I think aligns with Rodrigo's work. One of the questions I think you titled it, is it The Torture of Dr. Johnson?
Yes.
Right?
Right, because it's torture, yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Johnson wrote that the man who is asked by an author what he thinks of his work is put to torture and is not obliged to speak the truth.
Exactly.
And I feel like throughout this whole thing, there's always this torture of, what are you writing? What are you working on? What do you think? And like the response by the writer is always like,
yeah. Why are you asking me this question?
Yeah, I mean, a little more poetic than but it's like, that's kind of the sense you get, right? He wants to pull his hair out if there's any remaining.
Well, that's actually one of the questions in the very beginning of The Invented Part, isn't it? The protagonist, I think it closes that first. I'm not quite sure right now, but where he says, why doesn't anyone ever ask me these questions instead of always asking me like stupid questions about my work? I thought he goes into that. And it's interesting, some of the things that a writer would like to be asked about.
Yeah, it says the exact quote is that they always ask him, as a writer, where do you get your ideas, and why do they never ask what made you want to be a writer?
Yeah, exactly. That's it.
Yeah, which is right. I do want to mention too. Well, we did have the question like that. Rodrigo's not in the Thousand Forest.
No, well, because I had to get the older generation.
They were more journeymen.
Okay.
Yes, because the idea is that the anthology be something that sticks, that stays around for a while, and so you have to get them when there might not be much left. Much better written. I'm asking them, what are the best pages of your entire body of work? And if they're going to continue with their body of work, then it means the anthology doesn't last very long. So I spoke with Carlos Fuentes, the week before he passed away, unfortunately. So that pretty much sticks as what he considered, and he considered his best, pages. So that's that's why Rodrigo. But I kind of thought when I was reading Rodrigo, actually, that the next step would be getting a whole kind of new slew. And I kind of unfortunately thought, once they've all departed, I guess I would have to start all over again with
the next generation. Oh, no.
I know, isn't that terrible?
So this is actually an interesting bookend, because the very first time I became aware of Valerie Miles, not even knowing anything about her, was that issue of Granta, the young Spanish language authors.
Yes, right.
I was in my MFA program at the time and hadn't been reading much translated stuff, but was really into short stories. And so someone said, well, you should get Granta because they have really good stories in there. So kind of finding out about new authors, and that issue came out and it just blew my mind.
Wow.
Loved it quite a bit.
Oh, that's really nice to hear.
And Rodrigo's not in that one either, though.
Because he was too old.
He was too old.
I know, we're saying he's in the Goldilocks zone. He's either too old or he's too young.
Too old or too young. Exactly.
For Valerie Miles to anthologize him, he's just not the right age. It's just not going to happen.
Someday.
Yes, exactly. It's a matter of a couple of years there.
We're just playing with you.
Yeah, more or less kind of in my... I don't remember exactly the year, but we're more or less the same. We're around the same age. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So how did you find out about his work initially?
Let's see. That's a good question. Because I've kind of known Rodrigo for such a long time. I think I knew him before I knew his work. And this must have been like in the mid 90s, late 90s. So I think I met him in Madrid. He came to some event we were doing in Madrid, and that's where I met him. And so we were, both just getting started. It was before Mantra. So we were just getting started, both of us, in our respective careers.
And I just want to give some props to Valerie here. If you do read that Granta issue, there's some names of young Spanish authors that she included in the anthology that are just blowing up the scene now.
Yeah.
Like for instance, like nobody was reading Samantha Schweblin back then in English, and now she's shortlisted for a Man Booker Prize for her first book in English. There was Carlos Labé. There's
Andres Newman.
Right.
Andres Newman.
Andres
Alejandro.
Newman. Mm-hmm.
Patricio Prone.
Zambra.
Yeah. Patricia Prone, exactly.
So she kind of knocked it out of the park there. So if you
Carlos Ishimito is another one.
Oh,
I couldn't pronounce his name right, but I wanted to say it.
Polo Isharak.
Oh, yeah. Polo as well, yeah.
Polo
Yeah.
is on there.
I can't pronounce
So,
her
yes,
last name
what's
either.
huge?
So
Well, because it's backwards.
It's back, yeah.
yeah.
It's really Caracciolo, but she signs with her surname backwards.
And then the only last thing that I thought was a neat connection between your what you've done and what Rodrigo has here is my favorite story in A Thousand Forests and One Acorn was translated by the same person who translated The Invented Part. So I think that's kind of a neat connection as well.
Yes, he did a wonderful job because he translated that, but he also translated kind of all of the conversations and all of the pieces. A lot of the writers, but also a lot of the conversations, because it's an anthology, but it's also a book of conversations with the writers, and he did a lot of that work marvelously well. And I have to say, reading The Invented Part, it's absolutely amazingly translated.
I absolutely agree.
Incredible job, seriously. I take my hat off to Will. He's done an extraordinary job.
And he's going to be doing the next 2 volumes too, so it's going to be a treat and a lot of work.
Yeah, it's a real treat to read
And Will
like
also knows how to make his own sourdough bread from scratch.
This is true.
He is an amazing baker. I think he's a better baker than he is translator. So
well, that's hard. That's hard to do. So maybe he has a future.
He needs a subsidized translation through bread making.
Yeah.
Okay, but I'll put one more pin in this too, though, is that when we published A Thousand Forests and One Acorn, and Valerie came here did a book tour and came to Rochester, and that's where Brian first met her and where I first met Brian. So for anyone listening to this,
look at
that book is our connection is through your book.
Oh wow, that's wonderful! I'm glad to know that coincidence in time.
It seems like a perfect thing for like this to talk about Invented Part 2. That sort of like coincidence and coming together.
Exactly.
So I'll try and summarize this section. I think I don't know that I can actually do it this time. We've always started these off with kind of running down what happened, and in this chapter we've gotten to the end. We're into the third part of the book. So there's the first part, which is the real character. Then there's the second part that's a bunch of different things, and now the third part is the imaginary person. And in this case,
the second part's a bunch of different things.
Just going to go past that. I do have something to say about that though in a minute. But this one, we've got the author, the writer, who is in earlier sections has merged with the God particle in the Large Hadron Collider, has become like this giant figure that can rewrite time and is playing with his characters and making them go through all those motions. Now we get kind of the unveiling that he's tried to break into CERN and that didn't work out so well, and he's been at like a writers conference where he's talking about all the things that piss him off about like writing and literature.
That part's great.
Writing and griping.
Pages upon page upon page. Then we have my favorite section that I'll come back to in a second, and then we have him on the airplane flying, I guess, back home, and it's finally the moment where he's like, after all this griping, all these problems, all this like sort of despair at like the world sucks, everyone's just playing on their cell phones all the time and tweeting, and no one cares about literature anymore. I just can't do this anymore. He finally like has this moment where he's like, oh, I know what I want to write. I know how to write a book. It's going to be this, and it sort of describes the book that we're reading. And he looks out the window and sees like a boy in the water, which hails back to the very first chapter of this, where he as a young boy was drowning in the water, and claims that that's the moment that he came up with all of his stories, and it all kind of like circles back around. And he keeps making the point about these parentheses, about the kind of parenthetical nature of things. And the reason I said there's a bunch of stuff in the middle is that this book almost operates like 2 parentheses, one for like the first section, one for the third, and the middle is this almost like ellipses, where it's like each of these little points that kind of are framed by this kind of more circular space in which he's kind of invented the idea of this novel. Does that do an okay job? This section is loaded.
It does well. Yes, it is. I think it's a very good approximation.
And this is one of the funniest sections, I think.
I really liked how section 7 begins, because to me it seems like a mirror opposite of how the very first section begins, because it starts with a question mark, and he says it's a question mark like a hook, which a hook would submerge, under the water. And in this one, he says it's a question mark, but like the tip of an airplane wing,
right?
Which is taking you above and above the water. So it's this exact mirror opposite of looking at a question mark either down or up, and it kind of I think it plays like you're saying with these parentheses moving their way in.
Yeah.
It reminded me, and not to get too philosophical, because I'm not a philosopher by any means, and half of the time use the language and not 100% sure what I'm talking about, but it reminds me of a lot of, it's like phenomenology. He's using the bracketing of phenomenology in order to hold things together to put them in a space and then to look at them like under a microscope, kind of creating a little bit of a mise on a beam that he can go in and look at something, but held between those brackets, and then creating. I'm sure there's also got to be some going back to like Roussel and some of those kind of Olympian structural things that create kind of that little space in the center there where everything is going towards the center.
Yeah.
Like an aleph, like this space where consciousness is basically. He quotes actually Cheever on consciousness. Let's see, it's one of the things that I wrote down that I really liked. Let me see if I can find it in my notes here.
Wait, we were supposed to take notes? Oh, snap.
No, well,
I'm kidding.
This is something that happened to me. You know why? And I completely get his whole problem with e-readers, because I'm reading this on my e-reader, and it's rather clunky to go in there and try and find a quote and look it up in such a long novel, which if I had the actual physical book, I would know more or less where it was in the physical volume, and I have it underlined.
Underline it.
So,
yeah, just dog-ear it and underline on your e-reader.
With a sticky thing there telling me where it is. So unfortunately, I can't. But it was about consciousness. I know that.
That's too perfect, though.
It's beautiful, actually. It's exactly what he's talking about.
Didn't you mention at some point in time that you had a story about Rodrigo and his favorite Cheever story?
Oh, yes. Well, when I was overseeing MFA, which was it's a very important publishing house from Buenos Aires, from Argentina, and for some years I was overseeing kind of a regeneration or recreation of the catalog. It was Borges's house in Bioy Casares and Aida and a lot of great Argentine writers, and so I was taking also advantage to look at their catalog of kind of classic writers or contemporary classics, and I found that they were doing Cheever, and Cheever was had not been published in Spain. It was off catalog in Spain, so I wanted to recuperate Cheever, and I knew that Cheever was one of Fresán's favorite writers of all times, and actually wherever this quote is, he says that. Well, the writer says that it's his favorite writer,
right?
And So we talked, and I invited him to write an introduction to a collection of stories that he put together that was called The Geometry of Love, which was the title story and the name of the collection. And so we agreed that I bought the rights to all of Cheever's backlist, and we were slowly but surely going to be coming out with Cheever's books with introductions by Rodrigo, which would eventually be collected into kind of a semblance, of Cheever. Unfortunately, we only got to the first book, but one day when publishing, group publishing, they do those kind of things. But the first book was this collection, and one time he came to my office for us. We were going over a few things. He came to my office, and he brought Roberto Bolaño with him. So that was quite a lot of fun. That's how I met Roberto Bolaño.
Oh wow! We did find the quote too.
Geometry, geometry of love.
Yeah, since I read a physical book and underlined it here, I have the quote for you.
Well,
actually, on
good for you. Share that quote.
I did not underline it. Actually, I missed it, so I just happened to thumb on it. I got lucky.
Yeah, it's on page 502.
Go ahead, Chad. You got a good voice.
Okay, it says, I'll say goodbye with something that another of my favorite writers, John Cheever, said in his journal at the end of his life. Quote, I will say that literature is the only consciousness we possess, and that its role as a consciousness must inform us of our inability to comprehend the hideous danger of nuclear power. Literature has been the salvation of the damned. Literature has inspired and guided lovers, routed despair, and can perhaps, in this case, save the world. End quote. Good night and drive safe home and on to the rest of your lives. This really does build up, like, all of his bits about, like, that he's doing at, like, this writers' conference, which you just came from a writers' conference, and I'm sure it was nothing like this.
No.
There is a reason there's so much drinking at conferences, though.
I mean, exactly. Late nights and a lot of drinking. But, I think because, if there's one thing that Fresán has, he has this ability, this bathos and pathos ability where he goes up and down and at one moment we feel kind of very earnest in it, the next we're dying of laughter. He's got such an incredibly smart, engaging sense of humor, and he really kind of lets it go in this section, I think, a little bit, particularly.
My favorite part comes right after that, and I'll just get into it. I saved it for a little bit, but is when he gets done doing all of his panels or whatever, his presentation about the future of writing, and he's sort of like supposed to be the old cranky man that's like the real into literature, and he does all those bits, and then afterwards his IKEA, his nemesis, his ultimate, the person who's actually very successable, and everyone reads his books and so on and so forth, and most importantly, he has a lot of hair, which I wrote down in the side LeBron James. It's like,
he suddenly has a lot of hair. That's the little detail. Suddenly has a lot of hair.
Panda glands? Was it killing panda bears or
exactly.
something?
Yep. Baby panda bear glands. Small fortune in the black market. And then IKEA turns to him, and I'll just read two parts of this because I think it's just perfect. Because we've read 506 pages of like the writer sort of like, down on everything. It's all crap, and so on and so forth. And it's all in this book in which it is about being a writer. And IKEA says, I'll take this opportunity to give you some far more useful advice than the advice you once gave me. No, seriously, listen. Enough already with these books about writers, books about writing. Nobody's interested in literature, beginning with the majority of readers, man. And writers are only interested in their own writing, and at most to seem impressive, the writing of some distant dead man whom they latch onto as if they've known him all their lives. Normal people just want to pass time and feel represented. Haven't you ever read the comments on Amazon condemning a book with the worst possible rating? No? Read them and you'll see. The reason is always the same. Quote, I didn't identify with any of the characters, or quote, there wasn't a single character worth getting to know. Why do you think all my books have the characters' faces on the cover? And while you're at it, quit repeating that thing about the 140 characters of Twitter. That's not how it works. Not exactly. Don't talk about things you don't understand. And even worse, don't get pissed about what you don't know. Relax, man. Which, I can read those 2 pages over and over, and I'm like, that's exactly what my interns probably say when they walk out of this room. Like, dude.
Like what? There's another thing he quotes James, where it's tell a dream, lose a reader.
Yeah. Tell a nightmare.
Much better. A nightmare, at least it has a little something to it, no?
Yeah, absolutely. So this part is so fun, and it really is. It's got all of his stuff packed in here. Like there's all the little references to the different writers, to Nabokov shows up a lot in here. We got the Cheever stuff. There's even like maybe a sly reference to David Lynch. So there we go. I did it. I brought for everyone.
Got it in there.
For everyone drinking at home, there is the Twin Peaks
in every
reference.
single podcast, right?
Yep, but on page 521, there's the auteur dreams and those other films, highways frozen with traffic, or little people emerging from behind radiators, and films that seem pure dream, which I can only take to be a David Lynch.
There you go.
Homage. So, yep.
Well, he also talks about something about homo catastrophico. That he becomes the homo catastrophico of American literature, and Shiva Stein, no?
Yeah.
Like a bruised dancer. There's some part where he talks about the destruction of worlds, laughing tears, and an air-conditioned cell of impeccable credentials. Something that I see. Again, I can't go back. I don't know where that came from, but I thought that was a very, very funny section when he goes into these kind of crazy descriptions of things, no? Putting together. Yeah.
Yep, there is. I can't find that part either, but I know it's in here. But I do have so much underlined in this section. This was one that, like, it was just basically every page being like, yep, not at this, love this, this is perfect. I like, yeah. I mean, you could just go through all the different sections that you really like. It is interesting, too, how we've talked a lot about the book being written as 7 parts simultaneously, and that comes up in here, too. And that how that might seem like that would lead to randomness or lead to something that's like not that constructed, but this part really does emphasize how clearly and how precisely he's gone through and made sure that everything sort of fits and works, and the way that sort of blows your mind if you've gone down the path of but yeah, this is if you accept everything that's come before as being true about the writer, that he was the young boy, that he then merged with this god particle and became this giant head that's controlling like all these things. If you go down that sort of path, this just undercuts all of it, but it like exposes the kind of back workings, the scaffolding, and tells you explicitly like this is how this book is going to be constructed and what it's going to do, and yet that never is boring, which I think in the hands of a lesser author it wouldn't work. Even like his rants about stuff wouldn't work if it didn't have the right cadence, if it didn't have the right bits to it. It would just fall apart.
Sound cranky, which it does, because it's kind of like in a moment, he kind of allows himself. It's funny, the other day, very sorry, but I was watching CNN man talking about Trump, and he just kind of like, there was this moment where he couldn't stand it anymore. He said, I know. He goes low, we go high, all of that kind of stuff, but I just can't stand it anymore. I have to say it. And he starts talking about how, how can a man that looks like that be meting out these insults of other people? He's a pig. He's horrible. He's awful. Look at him. He's disgusting. He's repugnant. And then you could just see him just kind of like relax and kind of breathe finally, because he actually said it. And when I was reading that section, I was like, oh my gosh, he's having one of those moments, when he's just kind of like letting it all out there and just kind of getting cranky. It's hot inside and I'm hungry,
Yeah, exactly.
But then all of a sudden IKEA doesn't seem so bad, all of a sudden. So.
Right. And he's like, yeah, and IKEA's actually a good person. He came and saved me when I was like arrested for trying to break into the CERN. One thing we never brought up on here, which I'm going to link to in the post for this, and I'll just summarize it for you guys because it's a video that I think Brian might have seen, but I doubt you would have come across this, Valerie. But there was a hoax that was done like last year at CERN at the Large Hadron Collider, in which this person pretended that they were filming, that they were there late at night, and that people were on the rooftop doing like this ritualistic sacrifice to like a mysterious god, and they filmed it as if like they found these people doing that, and that they stabbed someone and they dropped the phone and run away, and it's all like this like found footage sort of hoax, and like the people got in trouble for like using this laboratory to like punk everyone. But it's kind of the perfect thing to fit into like this book where he's like, I broke into CERN, I merged with the god particle, and he's like, no, I tried and I'm in jail and IKEA has to bail me out because he was at this writers conference and all I do is write about writers and Beckett and
yeah. Well, it definitely has. I could see a lot of Beckett in there. I could see some Beckett. I could see a lot of Cortázar too. And
oh yeah,
like points of perspective, like how he changes the camera angle. Like that one story of Cortázar's, that the name is Las Babas del Diablo. I don't actually know how it's translated into English.
It's not the continuation of the woods.
Mm-hmm. No.
Is that? No, you're
it's
thinking
Las
about a
Babas
different
del
one.
Diablo. It's called. It's about someone who's taking a photograph and drops the camera, and so the camera angle, all of a sudden the reader's stuck inside the camera and kind of looking up at the treetops, because all of a sudden you're stuck in that frame of the camera looking up as if you're inside the camera, which is very much like Beckett's idea in his short film called Film. These
Right.
moving, the camera angles that move around and do things that are very difficult to do in fiction, but that here Rodrigo's playing a lot with, interestingly.
Yeah, it's very true. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that story. It's looking like the continuation of the Woods one, where he's like reading the book that then describes the person coming up behind him reading the book.
Right.
Which
exactly.
has a bit of that too. It does remind me the other thing about like the way that this sort of unpacks itself. So we found a few of the quotes, like on 532, it's like he's going to write a book that speaks a different language, its own, but that also tells you, okay, true, you don't understand me now, but you'll learn because I'll teach you. Let me see. Let's start at the end.
Yeah.
A book in which everything happens at the same time. And then another one of my favorite lines, a book that's obviously adolescent. Pimples, changing voice, altered personality and mood and character, always horny, but written from that second adolescence that begins at the end of middle age and the beginning of old age. But it reminds me of like when the Olympian writers would have the debates about like, do you tell people what your constraints are and let them see how the thing came to be, or do you keep that hidden because it shouldn't matter? Like that, like if you see the scaffolding, then you know like how the cathedral was constructed. But if you take it away and you just see the artwork there, then you can sort of imagine what might have gone into those parts. And this book sort of pulls off both of those tricks simultaneously.
Yes, I think so. Well, I think he definitely gives us the image of the scaffolding from the get-go with the parentheses, no? And he uses the word vulva, which he says, "Oh, but I don't like that word."
Yeah.
But that's very much like, I think he's giving us a sense of what that scaffolding is, and that's when I was kind of going back to this idea of the brackets, the phenomenological brackets, because that a lot of time it's like the idea of when you put something into brackets, then it becomes like the consciousness. You set the limits of knowledge, and then you move in, and you like the assumptions of the external world. You become looking inside, and this I think what's interesting about the novel is that it often goes out and in, out and in, out and in, that kind of constant camera angling, between what's inside and what's the external and the internal and the external world. So it's like kind of establishing reality, like our perception through all of these words that he creates that become like it's like his own language, and how he puts together words, makes compound words that describe his interior universe, taking exterior things but pulling them inside and creating the language.
Yeah, there was that reminds me too of like when we first started going through this. I think I sort of fell off of keeping track of it, but I feel like each one of these sections almost does that thing where it's sort of inventing not just the camera angle, but like a new medium for how to approach the writer or tell the writer's story. So there's ones that are explicitly like written notebooks, and then there's one that opens with like the reference to being a portrait and being painted and having that sort of quality. And each one of these sections sort of embodies one of those bits. And this one is very much like, this isn't quite the same because it's not a different medium, but it does have that feel of being trapped on a plane. Like trapped on a plane, and he's recounting all of this stuff. But you're in motion towards a destination, but that destination is like both, what it is, but it's also sort of questionable if you're going to make it there, which is why they all clap at the end.
Yes, absolutely. That's really kind of creating Foucault talks about heterotopias, and it's kind of like the creation of a heterotopia, which is like a space inside of a space that suddenly creates its own patterns and its own kind of existence. It's like a space that it's neither dystopia or utopia, but heterotopia. It means like museums are heterotopias, cemeteries are heterotopias, and boats are heterotopias because they have the movement, but yet it creates this like space of something where it has its own rules. And really, an airplane, if you think about it, it's nothing more than a boat, but in the air. So, and a boat is like a heterotopia, like trademark heterotopia. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's really interesting in the terms of, a crucible and kind of creating a little space there, where even the reader kind of feels suspended somehow. Mm-hmm. He's really good at doing that, isn't he?
Yes, very much so. And that I think there's even a line somewhere in here about that, about being suspended, or there's references to being suspended in the air. I can't think of where they would have been.
And in the water as well.
And in the water, yep.
Yeah, about tumbling and having no footing and no air, just right in between.
That whole book is an airplane. They're solving it. It's like, instead of the old snow globe joke, like, where it pans out, like, this is just an airplane.
Well, let me crash this wonderful, smart topic back down to earth.
There we go. Let's do it.
The way Rodrigo likes to do ever so often. And there's a very funny part about standing desks and hemorrhoids, which I thought was very, very silly, but true nonetheless. There's a brief little quote on page 482. Let's see. Very few acknowledge writer's other great stigma: hemorrhoids, consequences of so much time sitting. The hemorrhoids that keep you from sitting, and that one morning will make you tell the journalist who has shown up with his corresponding photographer, "Didn't you know I stand up when I write?" So here's I'll do an embarrassing true story. When I was in college, it was my senior year in college, I was studying literature, and my major was crazy impacted, so the only classes I could take were like these really hard 500, 600 level classes. And so that semester, I had to read something like 53 or 57 books in one semester. And it was like all like those big, fat British literature books that weigh a bunch and take forever. So I'm like, whenever I wasn't at work, I was at home up all night reading, because it just takes a lot of time to read all of that. And then you're lugging like a bag of like 800 pounds of books to school. And I developed a hemorrhoid from this.
Oh, God.
And I'm a college kid, so I thought this was something that like either pregnant women or really old men got. I had no clue what was going on with my body. I just knew that it had to do with my butt, and it was embarrassing to tell anybody about it. So I had to go to the doctor. Like, he was like, "What's wrong with you?" And I'm like, "I don't know. I'm just walking around like a baboon. I don't know what's going on." So he explains what's going on. Like, you can't carry books around. You just stand more. Stop sitting so much. And I was just something I was so ashamed of, embarrassed my whole life. But here I am, like this strapping young 22-year-old with hemorrhoids from sitting and reading old books all the time. And oh, jeez. So I got to this part, I was just cracking up.
And then you show up in the novel, no? In one of these great novels.
Yeah, I see myself in there. So
yeah.
All you writers out there and readers, stand up every now and then. Be careful.
Speaking of, this is an off-topic segue, but I'm going to take it anyways, is that I want to mention to everyone who's listening that Brian was the finalist for a book prize that we just found out about yesterday. That BOA Editions here in town has an annual prize for short fiction writing, and although Brian didn't win, he was the only finalist mentioned, so congratulations.
I got second out of 2 people, so you know what? Hey, somebody had to get second. That was me. Well, thank you. That's very kind.
It's a start. It's a start. Right. It's a start.
And it all ties into this, in that Rodrigo's read some of the stories that were in Brian's collection, and the title of Brian's collection is thanks to Andres Newman, because Andres Newman told him that the original title he had was not good. We've told this story on this podcast before.
I think he said it was shit.
Yeah,
actually.
he said it was shit.
But that was, yeah.
Directly. Well,
we had
isn't that what IKEA's good at doing here in this novel? IKEA's good at titling, I think, is he?
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
So be careful. Beware. Well, I think one of the things that I really enjoyed also in this novel in general is how he kind of pits 2 different style of American expats, from Burroughs and his Mexican experiences, and then also Scott Fitzgerald and the Murphys experiences. And Hemingway doesn't come off too great in this novel, does he?
No.
Little snarky.
Or Faulkner.
Well,
Faulkner just is like as in like never being there.
Yeah,
which is interesting too.
That has to happen. That kind of it doesn't have to happen, but it's I think it has kind kind of reverberations to the boom generation a little bit as I heard in another podcast you were talking about and mentioned how much Faulkner was kind of a very important reference for all the boom writers. And actually probably a lot of Latin American writers, probably a lot of American writers too, but a lot of Latin American writers have actually read a lot of Faulkner through the boom generation without even realizing, that there's so many echoes of Faulkner in their work. So it's kind of like Faulkner one step removed, Edith Grossman wrote a really wonderful piece about Faulkner in the boom generation.
Oh, really?
Really wonderful. Yeah.
I'd have to check that out because I like her quite a bit.
I don't know where it's published. I heard her give the talk in a festival in Washington, but I'm sure it's published somewhere, and it's really fantastic.
Oh, that's great. That's good to know. I'm going to find that.
She just really nails. If anyone really wants to understand why Faulkner was so important for the boom generation, Edith Grossman's take she nails it perfectly, and it's very easy to follow and understand.
It's in your book a lot too. I noticed a lot of the interviewers. I was so surprised as Faulkner being such an influence on them with talking about their families, maybe
Yep.
Hugely.
Yeah, it
hugely.
really is. And that's why this is always almost Faulkner. The writer almost reads Faulkner sometimes. Not quite. Gets close. But since we are interrupting your vacation, we should probably wrap things up a little bit. And I'm going to do the announcement part here, and then we'll end with our favorite quotes, because I have my favorite one that's part of my general raging at life. But to wrap this up, we are going to have one more special podcast in this 2-month review season. Do you want to call it a season, for covering the invented part? And that's going to come out next week, and it will be a conversation between Brian, myself, and Rodrigo, who wants to come on to talk about, I think, the podcast and about the book and about everything else. So that's going to be really fun. His son might make an appearance as well. So
oh dear.
Stay tuned for that. And then the week after that, we will have an introductory episode for the next season, which is going to be covering Thomas Janssen bestseller by Gudberger Bergson, which is the Icelandic Ulysses. And in contrast to, we call it the Icelandic Ulysses because it is wildly the what are you going to call it? The games that he plays, the wordplay that he uses, just the layout on the page, all the different games that Bergson plays in this book are very reminiscent of Ulysses. It's also a great Icelandic book about nationalism and the problems of nationalism, so it's fairly timely. And in contrast to Invented Part, it's maybe somewhat more esoteric, where the translator is going to be on the podcast, Lytton Smith, who's a really great reader, very smart guy, very great poet, and he's going to help sort of unpack some of the backgrounds that one needs to know to really fully appreciate it.
So you're saying it's going to be intelligent compared to what we've been doing?
I'm gonna bring it down.
Oh, okay.
Seriously, bring it down. But for anyone listening, get a copy of the book. You can get it through bookstores everywhere. You can also order it directly through our website, and if you use the number 2 followed by month, no spaces, just 2 month, and checkout, you'll get 20% off. So that'll be the next one that's coming out later. And I think the only other thing I was going to say is continue rating us on iTunes, because I want to see us get back into that top 100. That was pretty cool.
Yeah.
I like seeing the little logo. Feels good.
Well, if I may just give you a little plug, I think it's amazing the work that you're doing, Chad, and I think it's really wonderful that you're publishing this novel, because I think it's the type of novel that will gain with time, because it's very much captured its moment. It really is. It is a novel that speaks to the things that we're going through, I think, in the 2000s and the 2000 teens. It just really captures it all, and it's an exciting, amazing romp. It really kind of brings in youth culture and at the same time literature in a way. In Spanish there's this word that's called letra heridos. I don't really know where it comes from, but it means wounded of literature, I guess you could say. And it's really one of the great novels of the time. So congratulations to you, and congratulations to Will for the translation.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I have a question for you related to that. Have you read the second volume?
No, I have not yet. But I did go to the presentation in Barcelona.
Right.
Rodrigo
I saw pictures of that.
Yeah, because Will came over and I met him there, and we went out to the Giardinetto, which anyone who knows 2006 or the Savage Detectives knows the Giardinetto. We went to the Giardinetto and had dinner. But Rodrigo was presenting his book with Ignacio Echevarria, and Ignacio said something that was really interesting. He called the style of the book arborescent, which I thought
nice.
I thought was an interesting way of describing the style. But it sounded really truly amazing, and something, I think he opens that up towards the end of this novel, so you can have a sense for where it's going. And I know that Nabokov. Nabokov is kind of in this book it was F. Scott Fitzgerald. In the next book, Nabokov kind of takes over that role. I think it's a conversation. It's a conversation with him.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's gonna be fun to see how this all keeps shifting and changing too over the 3 volumes. It's gonna be fun to have them all out, all with almost identical covers, just different colors and different variations, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Someday, so stay tuned. Also, for anyone who really liked The Invented Part, his next book, The Bottom of the Sky, which isn't part of this trilogy, that will be coming out from Open Letter in May. It's a shorter book, and it's basically about American science fiction, 9/11, and the Iraq War. So it's different in tenor, but it has some of the same kind of games in a different way. A lot of similarities to his style of writing. But if you like this, you're gonna love that too. And we'll have copies in not too many months from now. But anyways, so I guess to close it out, do you have a favorite quote from this section, Valerie?
Well, there are so many. There's so many. Really, the whole book is just one long quote that you could just pull out so many things. But there was something, and I'm very sorry if it's not one of the more funnier parts of the book, but there's a list of kind of the types of books that he would like to read, because this is not only a book where the writer talks about writing, but it's really an homage to reading, to the act of reading, and to how much the writer loves to read, And so there's one place where it's there's a list of books that he would like to read and books that he would like to write, and there's one where he says a book that would read like a prayer, which I thought was very much a little bit what this book, in a way, I think there is an elegiac part of it. But at the same time, a very strong belief in the future of not only books but literature, and kind of the people who we're like a club of people who love to read. So he was giving us really good things to think that there's a good future ahead for literature.
I agree. Brian, do you have a favorite?
Yeah, mine's also kind of on a little bit more of a serious note as well, oddly enough. I just sometimes have this, at night I'll wake up and there's this crisis of faith where you're wondering whether it's publishing or writing, is it worth it? You look at the book, the books on your bookshelf, and I am killing myself. I'm working so hard for something to sit on a shelf, and you wonder if it's worth it. And I bracketed this part on page 490 with just a giant yes exclamation point around it, and it goes, he's at a bookstore, and watching them with a combination of shock and admiration and nausea, he couldn't help but remember himself, still unpublished, breathing deeply the perfume of foreign libraries, touching and caressing and setting up that golden moment when he'd be handed the first copy of his first book as his most supreme and sublime fantasy, and then the walk home with the book in hand, and the perfect instant of putting it in a shelf alongside so many others. That was it for him. He couldn't see anything beyond that. That was enough, and more than enough, to achieve ecstasy. The rest, which would come later, would be, in every case, not something to look for, but something that comes looking for you.
Yeah, that is really good,
yeah,
too.
I like that.
I just like the romance of, it is worth it, and it's... Yeah. What you're doing matters. All the time you guys put in, it matters, putting these books out. So don't lose faith, you guys.
Yeah.
All of us, don't lose faith.
So by contrast, the losing faith part comes when you're at the American Library Association, and the only books that are on display or that are advertised are all kids' books, young adult books. And so on page 497, there's a bit that says where he's giving giving one of his rants. He's like, and those young adult books that sell so well and end up being the hope of the industry, consumed voraciously by young adult readers who, with time, I suppose, grow up and stop reading, or, with luck, are pre-programmed to swallow the latest bestseller. Or maybe, who knows, become Peter Pan readers, 80-year-olds reading young adult books, dystopias and romances, jumping from here to there, the same books as before, books for readers who don't want to grow up, happy to live trapped in the loop of adolescent stories that begin and end in themselves and that don't build bridges or open doors to other territories. Which is like the entire industry, unfortunately. But with that, I guess sorry.
There's one more, maybe I can read one more quick quote.
Please do.
There was this, Scott Fitzgerald always, and it kind of serves as a motif throughout the novel about all good writing is swimming underwater and holding your breath. And then he says, then reading is like drowning, like not breathing, like discovering that when you stop breathing, there's another way of life, a strange way of life, narrated from that even stranger way of life, the one he's living now.
That's so good.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
So. Man, well, thank you, Rodrigo. Thank you, Valerie. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Rodrigo.
We've done it.
And thank you, Chad. I'm very happy to be here and talk about this book.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, and I'm sure I will see you in a month. 2 months.
Yes, exactly.
Barcelona.
I can't wait to have you. We'll do lots of things in Barcelona.
We will.
I'll show you around.
Awesome. Sounds good.
Nice to talk to you again, Brian. I hope to see you again too.
I do too.